Hey everyone, this is Carbonite, and today we're actually taking a look at the deck profile of my teammate, Joshua. So this is going to be his build for Chronojet post the August 25th ban list. So we'll kind of take a look at what the deck is looking like without the massive power of Swirler. So I have my friend Joshua, my teammate Joshua here to help me give some insight on the deck and what he thinks about it. So I guess we can start off. What do you think about the deck post the ban lists?
Honestly, much of it doesn't really change. Like, after playing with the new ban list, I realized that yes, the 5k does matter a little bit with Swirler, but there's this one extra tech that I like to play that honestly doesn't screw me over as much as Swirler. Because Swirler could just randomly soul charge and randomly get you a crit or a heal trigger, which might really suck, but with the new card I could kind of avoid that in a way. Well, I'll show it later in the profile.
Alright, so let's go ahead and get straight into the profile. So, as always, we're going to be starting off with the ride deck, starting off with Chronojet. I believe you do have to play Chronojet. You can't play anything else because the skill of Mazer Gear has to actually ride over Chronojet. Oh my gosh, this is so foiled. Your deck is too max rarity. When it's ridden over Chronojet, you get the extra Chronojet Crest, which is the thing that allows you to actually stride in the deck. Hopefully by now, everyone knows what Chronojet does, so I'm going to be going a little bit faster. Next up, we do have Upstream. Upstream just has the skill that when he's ridden by grade 3 with Chronojet, you Soul Blast 1 and search your deck for a copy of any grade 3. And then, of course, we do have the original Chronojet, which is just same Chronojet that we've had for how many years? Hopefully you know the skill by now, but in case you don't, it's just if it attacks a Vanguard while in GB2, it gets plus 5k, and your opponent can't call grade 1 or greater from hand to Guardian Circle. And then, of course, when you stride over it, you counterblast 1, choose one of your opponent's rear guards, and put it to the bottom of the deck. So, pretty simple things. You can't really do any experimentation with a Chronojet ride line. So, let's get into the main deck. Alright, so starting off with the grade 3s, we do have, of course, the 4 copies of Steam Fighter Banlist. So his skill is just a very simple one. Is that GB2, I guess? During your turn, if any player's rear was put to the bottom of the deck, it gets a passive 10k. And then if the more important skill is that when it's discarded for the cost of stride, you get to draw an extra card. So I would say this is probably the main search target off of the Smoke Gear Dragon. Said it right this time. Because this basically just refunds your cost for stride, because when you stride you do technically neg 1 from hand, but the fact that you're discarding Banlist makes it into a net 0. Right, so following up that, we do have 2 copies of a new card from the Festival Booster 2022. This card is, if I can figure out what this is called, oh, it's so shiny. Causality Dragon, Crucial Dragon. So this is the grade 3 cycle card for Dark States. It has a typical cycle card skill. I don't know why that was so hard for me. Where if your opponent drive checks or damage checks a trigger, it gets an extra 10k power and an extra 10k shield, so it serves double utility. And then his other skill is that when he attacks the Vanguard while not boosted, you put the rear guard behind him basically into the soul, and you perform all the effects. You choose one of your opponent's rear guards, retire it, and this unit gets an extra 5k. And then you can also remove your over trigger from the drop zone and give him a guard restrict on any, what is that, grade 1 or higher? Okay, I can barely see it with the foil there. Grade 1 or higher. So that basically locks them out of PGs. So, Joshua, how are you feeling about this new addition, this new grade 3 to the deck?
Honestly, I really like this card because you can honestly do some funny 2 to fast plays, because whenever your opponent gets a trigger, it gains 10k shield. So essentially if your opponent gets a trigger, it just increases the shield by 10k, which is could sometimes become valuable when it comes to the pass. But I think the main skill that we care about is the one that chucks it into soul, because not only do you generate 1 soul, so you can use GG later on, it also could retire a really important card. Like, I know against Ballista, typically I always try to retire the grade 1 or any important units they might need, because yes, Ballista can honestly plus a lot with all its skills, but eventually they'll run out of tempo, because then they won't have any like good units to call. So then I really like this card because it essentially gets rid of 2 cards off board rather than just using 1 off of Chronojet stride skill.
Yeah, definitely. Alright, let's go. Alright, so rounding out the last of the grade 3 cards, we do actually have the Evergreen Transfer. So I don't think I've actually featured this on a deck profile on the channel quite yet. But this is a Regalius piece, also from Festival Booster 2023. You play with Soul Blast 1, you choose one of your units, it gets plus 25 until the end of that battle. And then you choose your Vanguard, and it gets the continuous skill that all your opponents' units with 100 million or greater get crit -1. So basically, we can't play the Chalice. We can't. Well, we could theoretically play Forbid All, but I don't think calling an extra ball leaf is really worth it. Do you?
No. Maybe the Crucial Dragon, but it calls 2 Great Freeze, and you typically don't want to call Valen off the skill.
So we're basically just going with the next best thing. And defensive options, always really good. And it is your 1 of OT counter. That is actually going to round out all of our grade 3s, but you may have noticed that a certain card is missing from our main deck. And that is actually the extra copies of Chronojet Dragon. So Joshua, you want to get into why we're not playing any copies of Chronojet?
Yeah, so the reason why I don't like playing Chronojet in the deck, because yes, next stage can be a really good stride, but like sometimes if you don't have the correct drive checks, it really doesn't do as much. While unlike Fate Rider could honestly build an extra copy of a card in the G zone, which translates to an extra 5k to the field, compared to next stage only 1. Of Fate Rider essentially adds 2. And typically I feel like in this meta, Chronojet isn't really that fast anymore, but its mid game is kind of rough, so I'd rather just try and ante-up my opponent with like obviously having 4 balance. And I also play this one card that's the cycle card that essentially lets me build more advantage. So essentially we're trying to outlive and out-tempo our opponents, that we just keep Fate Ridering, and then essentially we're going to use the crest power to eventually gain so much power that eventually they can't guard anything.
And it does also give you a lot of extra space because we don't actually have to commit to the Steam Breath, right? So getting into the grade 2s, we obviously have to start off with the MVP of the deck, the actual Upstream Dragon. So just quickly going over his effect, most of you probably know this by now, but he is just a GB1. When he attacks a Vanguard, he gets an extra 5k until the end of the battle. Do note that he does actually have to attack the Vanguard actually to get that 5k, so if he attacks into a 10k rear, he does not go up to 15. But at the end of the battle, you can pay the cost, which is putting him into the bottom of the deck, and then you search your deck for 1 grade 1 card, you call it to a back row rear guard, and shuffle your deck. So there probably shouldn't be a lot of explanation of why Upstream is such a good card. It kind of just, I don't know, it just gets you your advantage. It gets you free GGs, which translates into card draws. It used to be able to get you swirlers, but nowadays we have other grade 1s to go into, which we're going to be seeing later in the deck. So we'll talk a little bit more about Upstream once we get into those grade 1 targets. Alright, so rounding out the grade 2s, we do have 4 copies of the Dark States Cycle card. So just to quickly go over it, it is a grade 2 cycle card, so when you pitch it during the ride phase, you can Soul Blast 1 and bot deck it in order to draw a card. Do note that in this deck specifically, the stride step is part of your ride phase, so if you have to pitch her for the stride, you do actually have the ability to activate that skill, which, does that come up very often?
A few instances. Sometimes I honestly have 2 of these cards and I have enough soul because, you know, the deck I build at least usually is able to accumulate a lot of soul. So typically, sometimes I do see 2 of them and I'm usually able to ditch them both and just Soul Blast 2 and just basically get the cards for free. So this card is extra utility. And it does also help you for that early game because it keeps you with a lot of cards in hand and it kind of prevents you from minusing from riding up. Now it does have a second skill, but that has to do with Persona Ride, and that is something you cannot do in Chronojet, so we're just gonna skip that skill real quick. Alright, so moving into the grade 1s, we do of course have the all-important GG. Her skill is just 2, that when she's placed on rear, if you have the Chronojet Crest, Soul Blast 2, draw a card, then if it was placed by a card ability, it gets an extra 5k. So most of the time, I believe this is what you are going to just be calling off Upstream, assuming you do have the soul for it, which is part of playing this deck. You do have to manage how many cards you have in your soul. Without Swirler, it's a little bit harder, but I think you just kind of do have to play smart. Any insights? How do we keep up enough soul in order to make sure we can keep using GG? Well, there's a lot of cards I could use to build soul. So you know the cycle card, the grade 2. Essentially, what I like to think about is that you're essentially, when you see it early game, you're essentially paying half half the cost of GG, because as you can see, GG is a Soul Blast too, but if you were to use Lemain early game, not only is it like your best discard, it also just only pays Soul Blast 1. So since you're covering Soul there. So if you like see these two in hand, honestly I'd usually just ditch the Lemain and maybe not even use GG skill, because you're essentially, you could honestly use that Soul for later on, where you call it off upstream. There's also a couple other cards that help me build Soul, so typically this cost isn't really that hard to fulfill.
Alright, so moving on, we do have a card that I hate with a burning passion, because this man always opens it on me, and it is also the main way, or one of the main ways we can build up a ton of Soul. That's the 4 copies of the Steam Skara Zargon. So Zargon does have the skill that whenever he boosts, you give the boosted unit the skill that if its attack hits, you can choose 2 cards from your drop and put them into your Soul. So now there is a little bit of a funny interaction with this card and Fate Rider, where actually the boost step occurs before the attack step, or they occur at the same time if I recall, whatever. You actually give the skill to Fate Rider, and then you can actually time leap this card and keep the on hit skill, which is very dirty, but it doesn't really matter that much. Most of the time people will be PGing your what's it called? Fate Rider. I don't know why I can't remember that card's name. Any other insights?
No, this card's just really busted. Typically you always want to see its first turn, because essentially if you always call it down behind Vanguard, you can essentially make your Vanguard really hard to guard, because either they have to like commit a lot of cards to board on hand to guard it properly, or one to pass it, which could also be really risky, because if they get the one to pass, and it's just you wasted card nothing, and they still get the free 2 Soul. And I like to think about it like when this attack hits, essentially you just get a free GG proc, which obviously could be really scary. And most of the time it does hit, because you know most players are smart and they'll usually just won't risk the one to pass.
Very nice. Right, so now it looks like we've gotten into the Swirler replacement segment of the deck profile. So of course we're going to be starting off with the 2 copies of Ling. So her skill is just that when she is placed on rearguard, you check the top 2 cards of the deck. You choose one of them, put it into your Soul, and the other goes to the bottom of the deck. So, how does this feel as a Swirler replacement?
Sometimes it does kind of suck, because like typically your best first grade free stride, you typically want to have an upstream behind a Brainwash Swirler, because that essentially makes like 28, which is like a magic number. But honestly, in some ways, I do like this card a bit more, because it lets me check the top 2, and like I have many instances where I like check the top 2 and I realized the next card was a trigger, and the next card was normal unit. So essentially I was able to just put the normal unit into the Soul and essentially keep the trigger in the deck, which sometimes can be really helpful, because then that means I could just sack triggers later on, because now I have more triggers in the deck. So it does come up. It's really helpful, honestly. Honestly, the more I think about it, the more I prefer this card over Brainwash Filler, despite the 5k difference.
Yeah. And I mean, even putting it onto the bottom of the deck doesn't really mean anything, since you're always going to be shuffling after you use either Upstream or Fate Rider. So even if you bot deck your OT, it's still going to be in circulation at some point. All right, so finishing off the main deck grade 1s, we do have the 1 copy of Jewel Core. I believe this was played around with some lists, even when we had Swirler, but let's just quickly go over it. So it has a ride line skill, which we're not going to care about, but the main skill that we care about is that when it attacks or boosts, this unit gets an extra 5k until the end of the battle, and then it goes back into the Soul. So this is our second Swirler replacement. How do you feel about this one? I think you played it a little bit before, but took it out.
I think it's an alright card. Essentially, compared to Swirler that takes out like 1 card from deck, this essentially like doesn't take out a card from deck because it doesn't Soul charge. It just it puts itself into Soul. But one of the main reasons I don't like it is that if you see it early game, if you swing into it, it'll just go to Soul, which essentially means you lose out on a card on board, which honestly really sucks. It may be able to make better numbers, but you won't be able to like pressure with that card anymore. I do like the 5k, but like it doesn't really matter that much. It only really matters when I usually call upstream to a back row and there's like another upstream on the other side, because sometimes what I like to do is like with upstream dragon, I used to like to call Bling to the other rear guard, and then with my Crochet Dragon, which is the grade 3, just put it into Soul, which since he builds 2 Soul. While with this it doesn't really matter because it's just a 13k booster, because it can't really give the 13k boost, because obviously with Crochet Dragon you have to swing unboosted. So I think the card only comes up in like a very few scenarios, so it's not really that good, but it sometimes comes up. I'd rather just play it because, you know, the 13k might matter in some instances.
Alright, so next up, I guess we'll quickly go over a couple of the most optimal upstream targets. So we do have these 4 grade 1s that we could potentially go for. So what do you usually aim for when you're using your upstream? What are we shooting for, and what situations would you go for each?
It really depends on the board today, because sometimes I don't have any grade 1s to call to the back row. If that were to happen, I usually just call Zargon off of upstream, because then you can just use Zargon's skill to give the Fey Rider the on-hit skill that when it hits, put 2 cards in Soul, so essentially they have to PG it. If you ever have like 2 cards in Soul, typically you want to go into GG, because obviously you want a card advantage. You usually go into Ling. I usually like going into Ling, that whenever I have the other grade 3, the grade 3 Crucial Dragon on the other side, you can essentially, this lets me essentially add 2 cards in Soul, because Ling gets to add 1 Soul, and then Crucial Dragon gets to shove it into Soul, which essentially gives another Soul, so that's essentially 2 cards which you could use for another GG proc. Dual Core, I typically only call off when either I have like a grade 2 on the other side. Essentially a rear guard is not Crucial Dragon, because then the 13k base actually matters. So then you'd be able to like give the 13k power to the other unit rather than...
And it does definitely help make those magic numbers, because that's 13 plus 15 alone is just 28, which is a really good number. Not to mention Crest and any power from Fate Rider. So probably like more pushing when you're doing funny monkey plays, building advantage, and just really odd scenarios, right? So kind of like that. All right. Alright, so just getting on into the basic stuff, we do have the 3 PGs playing the RM because it's in theme. Is there actually any reason to play RM?
Not really.
Yeah. And then, of course, we do have to flex that max rarity Elementaria from BCS Worlds. We've got a world finalist here. Well, I don't know how we say that. A BCS champion. That's more accurate. Just playing it in the deck for the deck profile. Alright, so getting into the trigger lineup, pretty basic deck. Most standard decks are just playing the 8 crits. Currently, we do have the 4/4 splits on the Solin crits and the just vanilla crits. Any comment on that? Is there any reason to actually use this card over just a vanilla crit?
The more I thought about it while playing this deck during like Shop Challenge, is what I realized that I'd rather just play the regular crit, because sometimes it comes into a scenario where you'll want to swing with the crit because you kind of want to put it on bottom because you don't really have any better targets, and that's kind of really bad because it's a 4k base, which means if you put it behind a booster like AK booster, it literally can't hit the Vanguard, which some instances it does matter, so it's kind of really bad. So the more I think about it, the Solin doesn't really matter because once again we have so many cards that already build Soul. So the more I think about it, I'd rather just take this out and put like a regular crit so that whenever the scenario does come up where I have to put it in deck, it at least can hit the Vanguard.
Yeah. So I feel like Solin crits are slowly kind of being seeped out of the meta. Just like hitting that extra number is just so important these days. I don't know why. So finishing up the last tiers, we do have the 3 fronts. Do we draw enough in this deck?
Honestly, I would honestly say yes. In most other Chronojet builds, you don't really have that much advantage, but as you can see in my build, I like play like 4 Balance, like always draw consistently. I played a 4 Lemaine, so like always draw consistently early game, and I have so many cards that let me build Soul, which essentially translates to more GG's procs, which essentially means I draw more cards. So what I noticed with this deck is that I started drawing so much more that sometimes I usually just draw into my draw triggers, which kind of feels crap. So many times I'd rather just have the extra 10k shield, because that could honestly come up a lot, because there's many units in Vanguard right now that hit for like that magic like 18k base. So with this I could just 2 to pass it.
Yeah.
Very nice.
Yeah. And also for certain decks that hit 28k numbers, like what is the deck you lost? Anyways, let's finish it up. We got the 4 heals. We're not playing any counter heals. Would we ever care about counter heals?
I guess maybe sometimes if there's like a meta that like a card, or I mean I should say a deck that like completely dominates the meta, but at the moment there's like both like Willista and Gandiva, which I say are the 2 best decks, and they both honestly have the restand and the other one has the crit, so I'd rather just play safe and just have the 15k shield, because the 15k shield does matter, because like if you see it earlier you could like 2 to pass Vanguards. If you just have a 10k shield, you really can't do that, so I'd rather just be safe and you can just always have good shield at all times.
Yeah, I feel like the meta is kind of just too diverse, and especially at our locals. There's a lot of people playing Gandiva and a lot of people playing Willista, but there's also a ton of people just playing the most random Acid 9 decks. And I feel like if we try playing counter heals, we're going to get matched up against them every single time and lose because of it. So finishing off the deck profile, we do have the blue OT over Dark State's OT. Just quickly going over it. It is, I think we saw this in our Willista deck profile. You give the 100 million, and then the additional effect is you choose a card for drop, put it to your hand, and then one of your units gets an extra critical into the end of turn. So why have we switched over to blue OT?
So what I noticed when playing this deck is that Dark Stage OT, yes, it doesn't matter when you strike into next stage, because you get 10k power and a crit on 2 Vanguard Suites essentially, but as you can see, we don't play next stage, so it doesn't really matter. But one thing I noticed that most of the time, whenever an opponent fights against Chronojet, they typically always PG the Vanguard. So essentially, if I were to rip Darkseid's Overtrigger, Overtrigger is essentially like meaningless because you have to stack the crit on Vanguard, which essentially means you lose on like a point of damage. But with this, you can like stack it on anywhere. So if you were to rip the Blue OT, you can honestly like put the crit on something else. So that's like a guaranteed 2 damage compared to where you're only getting guaranteed like 1 damage. And also, the nice thing is that this could let you add cards from drop. So essentially, if I were to finish my drive check, I could like take a look at my hand and see, oh, I could like get an extra trigger. Or if I were to use a PG earlier, I could honestly add a PG to hand. But if I were also to have no stride fodder, because as you can see in my deck list, we don't really play that much stride fodder. We typically want to like draw into it with like a lot amount of draws engine we have. But like if we were to, let's say, trigger this, we can honestly, if we don't have any great freeze in hand, we can honestly just put like a balance to hand. And essentially, we have anything you need for next turn. So I really like Blue OT because it's like a lot more safe than Dark State's OT, and like it lets us like plan accordingly when we do trigger it.
All right, so I guess we'll finish off with the G Zone. Shocker, we're playing 4 Fate Rider. I guess we go over the skill. I was thinking not to, but whatever. It's a G unit. When it attacks CB1, flip something, put a rear guard on the bottom of the deck, search for something with grade +1, and then you call it to rear. And then you choose one of your units plus 5k for each face-up card in your G-Zone. That's the only card we can go into because the other are 4 copies of Next Stage. And you can only go into Next Stage by discarding a Chronojet Dragon, which we play total of 0 copies in the deck. Alright, so we're going to go ahead and finish off the video with just a test hand and just guiding you guys through some of the plays. So for this scenario, we're going to be going second because that is the only way Chronojet can win. That's not true, but we're going to pretend that it is. So let's take a look at our opening hand. It's okay, I suppose. We do have the Psycho card. We have extra 15k guard, which personally I would keep, but what do you think, Joshua?
Knowing me, I'll just put the trigger back because I'm going to put free back and then get also free triggers in return. But yeah, typically we always want to put our grade freeze back because
we're
don't
going
really
to search
do
them out.
anything.
Yeah. GG is debatable. We don't actually have anything else to help us facilitate. We don't have a Zargon, so it could help for early rush, but do you think?
I'd honestly still keep it because it is a grade 1 that you can use to rush, because even if you wouldn't use the skill when you first call it, because like I feel like in this instance you just discard the Lemaine and like Soul Blast 1 and like draw a card off of that and just call off the GG, because I feel like in this meta, if you have a really strong early game, you can essentially put your damage to your opponent to such a high damage that when you go into your like first or second strike turn, they're like really struggling to like guard everything. Because most decks pop off when they reach grade 3, so that means essentially the more early game you have, the better the deck should be, because they just have to essentially just take everything and hope for defensive.
It makes it so that you close out the game that much faster, and it's much harder for them to like continue doing their big OP plays. But let's see what we get. Whoa, we did get that trigger and another one. Can we get a third? No, it's just a Ling, which is actually really good.
Yeah, honestly, save 2 Lings in the first turn is honestly super good, because essentially they just both translate to like extra free cards. So like essentially here, as you can see here, GG would essentially cost a Soul Blast 2, but because we have these 2, they basically translate to Soul Blast 2 to draw 2 cards compared to just the 1 card draw.
Yeah, and that helps us kind of keep in our early game, and so maybe we can draw into more early game pieces.
Yeah, we're kind of missing 1 key piece right now.
Anyways, let's go ahead and go second, and we're going to be drawing a bunch of cards this turn, so we're going to draw for turn. Not great, but of course we do have Cycle card, so we're going to ride and use Broken Mechanics to draw 2 more cards. Ooh, that's an okay early game, I suppose. But we're going to Soul Blast out the Dran, put in the main and draw into another trigger, as is typical. So in this situation, do we think it's worth rushing pretty hard? For now, so we swing GG. Hopefully, I don't hit a defensive and swing the Vanguard and try check into another grade 3, which is, you know, great stride fodder. So going into our opponent's grade 2 turn, do we need any damage?
No. Typically, if you can, you guard everything.
Yeah, but thankfully we're so good at the game, we drew into all of our triggers, which means we can guard early. Wow, another trigger. We're so good.
Yeah.
But we can just pitch the main again. Ride, Soul Blast, not put that card underneath the deck. We put it on the bottom, and then we shuffle the deck and draw one card. Ooh, that's actually really good.
Depending on the matchup, I would consider calling upstream here to like have like a better early game. But let's say this was Gandiva, I typically wouldn't call it off here.
Especially if you're going second.
Yeah, especially. Ballista maybe, but they might attack into it. So, and looking at this hand, we essentially don't have that many good attackers, so we typically want to keep it here.
Yeah, so I think we probably would just move the GG back. We could commit the Jewel Core. What do you think?
I don't know, because it does add an extra soul, but like essentially we're just losing out on a card. I'm not too sure, to be
But we do also have this to generate soul, because we do, if we want to call GG off upstream next turn, we would need 2 soul. This would help us get to 2 soul, but this would also help us get to 2 soul. If we're playing against Gandiva, this isn't going to be there, so we're going to need to call something else behind it, or whatever we're calling off upstream.
Yeah.
We're thinking way too hard about the swing pass! Okay, now we need damage. How much damage do we need?
Typically you only need 1 damage because you don't always have to use the stride skill. So typically in Chronojet you want to guard as much as you can and just, you know, take 1 CV. So typically I like to always like guard the rear guards and just take the Vanguard swing, because many instances, like, you know, the Vanguard's too big. Except against Gandiva, you typically just want to, like, you know, guard it and then just take the rear guard swings. Because they might consider damage on you, but I wouldn't, because essentially
no one's gonna damage deny Chronojet. No one thinks this deck is good enough. Anyways, let's take a couple rear attacks. Gandiva is swinging for 23. Guard, that is 1 to pass. Do we want to make it 2 to pass?
You wouldn't typically want to use the front here. If we're up against Gandiva, we typically just use the 2 crits we have.
2 crits, yeah.
That'd be
so
40.
40k, that's 2 to pass.
And we typically just take the rest of the rear guard swings, which could either be like 2 or 3 damage.
Well, it would only be, well, depending on how they swing, because they can't multi-attack quite yet. But let's say they call their full board in order to try and get us there, or get themselves to that 5, because they do need to commit a lot of rear guards in order to actually get to 5 bound cards. If we're getting to Gandiva, that would be dead.
Yeah.
Whoa, we drew into another trigger. Now we have to decide what the worst card in our hand is.
Honestly,
I think I have a decision. What do you think?
I also think I have a decision.
Okay, what do you think it is?
Honestly, actually, it may not be as bad as I think, because the way I think about it, GG doesn't really get us off value, but if we were to call Jewel Core here and it were to move the soul, we could call Link behind Vanguard, and that essentially adds the 2 soul, which means when we do call upstream, we could essentially get a free GG. So I think we honestly did GG here.
I was gonna say Banlist, but was that your first answer too?
I mean, actually, Banlist, how many grade 3s do we have? Because I was thinking about maybe calling...
I mean, we're gonna search out another Banlist, but if we do want to call this, then that would also be fine to like ditch.
Yeah, because like we don't really have that many good attackers besides upstream at this point.
Oh, I forgot that we had to use 1 soul for upstream.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say. So the Jewel Core could help us build an extra soul, and then we could just call a Link to get an extra soul, which essentially means we have 2 soul, and then we have enough for GG. Another thing you could do is, like, sometimes depending on the scenario, if I have only 0 cards in soul, I'd like to call like a Zargon behind Vanguard, but since we're using Jewel Core right now, so like essentially we'd call like Jewel Core, then upstream, and then probably a Kufu Dragon and other rear guard circle. So what we do is probably swing upstream, because once again, magic number 28. That's crazy.
And then of course this goes to soul. This goes to bottom. And we call out the Ling.
Yeah, we call off the Ling because if we had 0 cards in Soul, what I typically like to do is put Zargon behind Vanguard so that essentially if it does hit, I get 2 cards into the Soul, which essentially means a free GG proc. But since we already have 1 card in Soul, I'd like to be more safer and put Ling behind Vanguard because if the Vanguard hit doesn't hit, then that means we don't have enough to like build obviously GG. But this is basically a guarantee. So we could essentially check the top 2. Look at that, a trigger. Whoa, this is why we like playing Ling, because sometimes with Swirler we soul charge the front, but now with this we get to save the front.
And then we can swing the Fate Rider, and I assume we're time leaping this Ling.
Yes.
And then we can get an upstream, and then that upstream is going to generate another grade 1 for the Crucial Dragon, so we can retire to... Oh, we didn't use Stride Skill. Now's the time to use Stride Skill, right?
We typically honestly use Stride Skill here.
If you have the CB, you probably go for it, but if you only have 1 CB, you obviously want it for Fate Rider.
Oh yeah, and also typically when you use Fate Rider skill, you obviously want to give the 5k to upstream, because then this will hit for 25, which since it hits over a trigger.
Heal typical Tribe Check L.
Honestly, we'd probably heal 1 to be honest, because if they were like a good player, they typically like try to guard.
Yeah, they'd keep themselves at 1. Yeah,
probably guard before the upstreams or the Fate Rider swing, because essentially before the Fate Rider they gain like 5k to front row.
Oh, so that's a 25k swing, right?
Yeah, and typically we give power here.
What are we calling off? The GG?
Yeah, GG, because we already have 2 cards in Soul, so this lets us get another card
into hand.
Yeah.
And an extra 5k, although the 5k doesn't matter because we're probably just going to shove the Soul, right?
Yeah, because like...
Well, we get the 5k anyway. Well, we're just losing boost. He gets 5k, so that's cool.
Yeah, honestly, sometimes you may not want to use the skill here because like if they don't have anything to like, you know, retire, we might not want to use skill here, but like in many scenarios, you typically want to use a skill because this one obviously gets us a free card in Soul.
And a retire, yeah, 5k. Alright, and then that is our first Stride turn.
And then if you take a look at our hand, we honestly have a good amount of guard. We have lots of triggers in hand. Obviously, once again, as I said, we kept the Balance in hand, which means if we would like do everything, we were actually at least the Balance, we wouldn't have Stride Fodder for this turn, which is why I decided, because in my deck build, you typically don't have that much Stride Fodder. We only have like 7 targets max, which is why I typically want to hold on to Stride Fodder, because like in case I don't see it, it'd be really awkward if I would like strive like, you know, 3 grade 1. That'd be like really bad.
Let's ditch a PG and double Zargon to Stride. But we do technically have Lynn to like mitigate that a little bit, because she's going back into the deck and you're shuffling deck, so you're probably going to draw into her again. But of course you would obviously just rather 1 card Stride, so it's a 1-for-1. Because even if you do discard the Ling, that's still just a -1, because you do at least, you go -2, but you draw 1 back. So definitely want to be discarding Banlist in order to just break even. Alright, so that is going to do it for the deck profile. I hope you guys enjoyed taking a look at one of my teammates' decks. Don't forget to do all those YouTube things, like, comment, subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next one.